I don't work with incompetent people like you, my mother laughed, her voice sharp as a knife echoing through the meeting room. You're nothing but a ghost in this house. Now get out. I didn't argue. I simply walked to the elevator and approved the $5.1 billion withdrawal. The next morning, 120 missed calls. Ismay, answer it. We're going to lose the tower. The banks are seizing everything. Her panicked voicemail screamed. I stared at the phone, my mind returning to the night the decay began to show. That cold Tuesday when the air was so sweet. The frantic ringing of the present faded away, replaced by the sharp, polished echoes of the night the betrayal truly began. The Chicago skyline was a jagged graph of light against the freezing November dark, visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the penthouse. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the hollow hum of 100 high society conversations. I walked through the crowd in my charcoal designer dress, feeling less like a guest and more like a ghost haunting my own family's celebration. In my clutch, I gripped a small, worn handkerchief that had belonged to my father. It was frayed at the edges, a stark contrast to the silk and diamonds surrounding me, but it was the only thing in this room that felt real. My father always told me that true wealth isn't found in a bank ledger, but in the quiet integrity of one's soul. I stood by a marble pillar, watching my mother, Griselda, hold court at the center of the room. She was draped in emeralds, her laughter sharp and practiced, the sound of a woman who viewed her children as assets rather than people. To her, this home wasn't a sanctuary. It was a high-end prison built on the foundations of ego. I remained stoic, moving through the shadows of the pillars, choosing to speak only when my words could actually improve the silence. My sisters, Solveig and Amaryllis, caught my eye from across the room, their glares transactional and cold. They didn't see a sister. They saw a competitor for a shrinking pie. I approached my mother, my heart steady despite the dismissal I knew was coming. I held out a small, wrapped box, a rare first edition book I had spent months tracking down, a gesture of the daughterly love I still stubbornly harbored. Griselda didn't even break her sentence. She didn't look at the gift, nor at me. She simply signaled a passing waiter to take it from my hand as if it were a piece of trash. In that moment, the sting was sharp, a familiar blade in an old wound. Have you ever placed your trust in the wrong people, only to realize that even blood can have a price tag? I looked at her and realized I hadn't been forgotten. I had been erased from her heart long ago. Don't just stand there like a statue, Griselda finally snapped, her voice cutting through my thoughts. Go to the library. There's inheritance to discuss, and you're running late. I didn't argue. I just nodded and left, the weight of the handkerchief in my hand the only warmth left. At that moment, I understood that a family built on such cruelty could never last long. The library doors closed with a heavy thud, sealing out the music. Griselda entered behind me, followed by a man whose age and power felt like a suffocating shroud. Senator Vance. Without a hint of irony, my mother revealed the night's true purpose. She was brokering a political alliance, and the currency was me. She called it a family duty, but it was an auction, plain and simple. The Price Empire needs stability, Ismay, she said, her eyes as cold as the Lake Michigan wind. The senator will provide the influence we need, and you will provide the union. It was a legal transaction, a soul-crushing maneuver masked as tradition. Solveig stepped forward then, a thin, predatory smile on her lips. You look tense, Ismay. Have a drink. It's the vintage you like. She handed me a glass of deep red wine. I took a polite sip, my mind racing for a way to decline this madness without causing a scene that would jeopardize my own secret plans. Within seconds, the room began to tilt. My vision blurred into a smear of gold and shadow. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird sensing the cage closing. I realized with a jolt of horror that Solveig had spiked the drink. They weren't just selling my future. They were sabotaging my senses to make me look unstable, ensuring I couldn't fight back. I leaned heavily against the mahogany desk, my knuckles whitening as I fought the drug's heavy pull. Griselda watched me with a clinical detachment, as if she were observing a faulty machine. My sisters snickered in the corner, their faces distorted by my failing sight. I whispered to myself, a mantra my father taught me. Strength is not about never falling. It's about how you rise when the world wants you on your knees. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a collapse. I found a chair and sat with iron-backed dignity, my gaze fixed on a point they couldn't see. Griselda walked over and slapped a document onto the desk. It was a total waiver of my inheritance rights and a voluntary conservatorship form. "Sign it," she commanded. "You're clearly in no state to manage your own affairs. It's for your protection." In my drugged state, the pen felt like a lead bar, and the words on the page danced like insects. She called me inferior, a liability, and a disgrace to the price name. I looked up at her, my heart breaking not for myself, but for the mother she could have been if she wasn't so terrified of being small. I signed the papers. My hand was shaky, but the signature was legal. They thought they were stripping me of my power, but they were actually handing me my freedom. They didn't know about the $5.1 billion in the ISM Asset Fund, the investment keeping this very building standing, which was under my sole anonymous control. By signing their worthless waiver, I was cutting the final legal tie that required me to protect them. I was no longer a daughter bound by duty. I was an independent variable with the power to pull the plug on their entire world. I managed to stand, my dignity the only thing keeping the drug at bay. I walked out of the library, past the laughing guests who had no idea the floor was about to vanish beneath them. I stepped out into the Chicago night, the freezing air biting my skin and clearing my head just enough to reach the curb. I was officially an outcast, penniless in their eyes and discarded by my own blood. But as I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed in my clutch. It was a message from Lazarus. "The trap is set. All we need is your word to stop the heartbeat of their empire." I looked out at the city lights, my eyes clearing with a cold, absolute resolve. Let them have their party. Tomorrow, the bill comes due. The morning light over Chicago was too bright for a head still heavy from Solveig's sedatives. I stood outside the executive boardroom of Price Global Holdings, smoothing my suit. My reflection in the glass was pale. My eyes, however, held a cold, unwavering clarity. Inside that room sat the board of directors and the women who shared my blood, but none of my heart. I clutched the digital folder containing the verified records of the fraud Griselda was about to finalize. Blind ambition is the fastest way to lose everything you have spent a lifetime building. I took a breath and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors. The room fell silent as I entered. Griselda sat at the head of the table, flanked by Solveig and Amaryllis. The air was sterile, smelling of expensive cologne and stagnant power. I walked to the center and projected the legal proof of the $5.1 billion risk. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the calm authority of a woman who had seen the bottom of the ledger. "This acquisition isn't a victory," I told the room. "It is a trap designed to collapse this empire under the weight of uncollateralized debt." Griselda didn't even glance at the data on the screen. She leaned back, a slow, mocking smile spreading across her face. Then, she began to laugh. It was a sharp, grating sound that echoed off the glass walls and through the live internal feed. "Ismay, you truly are a disappointment," she said, her voice dripping with venom. She stood up and pointed a manicured finger at me. "I don't work with the inferior. You are a liability. A girl who can't even handle a glass of wine without staggering is in no position to lecture this board." The board members smirked. Solveig's eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction. Griselda signaled the security guards standing by the door. "Remove her," she commanded. "She is no longer part of this conversation or this company." As the guards gripped my arms, I didn't struggle. I looked directly at my mother, feeling a profound, weary sorrow. Mothers are supposed to be the anchor that holds a family steady, not the storm that sinks the ship, I said quietly. "I hope the price of your pride is worth the cost of your soul." The guards marched me toward the exit. I kept my chin high and my shoulders back. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to remain centered within it. Even as the grip on my arm tightened, I refused to let them see me break. If you were in my shoes, would you have stayed silent to save face, or stood your ground knowing you would be humiliated? I didn't care about the stairs. I cared about the truth. The doors clicked shut behind me, sealing me out of the empire I had spent 10 years secretly protecting. I retreated to the quiet of the third-floor break room to gather my thoughts. My hands were finally starting to stop shaking. A few minutes later, Amaryllis slipped into the room. Her face was a mask of calculated devastation. "Ismay, I'm so sorry," she whispered, rushing forward to wrap me in a hug. I tried to stop her, I really did. I let her hold me, wanting, just for a second, to believe that one shred of family love remained. But as she pressed against me, I felt a familiar, sharp vibration against my pocket. It was a digital cloner. While she was comforting me, my sister was expertly copying the encrypted keys from my phone. These were the keys that accessed the communication logs of the ISM Asset Fund. I noticed the subtle hum, but I didn't move. I chose to observe. I needed to see exactly how deep this betrayal went. Amaryllis pulled away, her eyes glistening with fake tears. She immediately began typing a message on her own device. I saw the flash of the screen. "Ismay is the traitor," the text to Griselda read. "The ivy that looks the most beautiful is often the one strangling the tree." I looked Amaryllis in the eye, my voice soft but steady. "Betrayal is a heavy burden to carry, sister," I told her. She froze, her thumb hovering over the screen. "I truly hope that whatever you think you gained today is worth the loss of the only person who actually cared for you." I didn't scream. I didn't accuse. I simply withdrew my energy and walked away, leaving her standing in the sterile light of the break room. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor to reveal Solveig waiting with a legal team. She held a thick stack of papers, a court-ordered emergency conservatorship. Based on the inheritance waiver I had signed while drugged and the public instability from the boardroom, they were moving to strip me of my legal agency. In the eyes of the state of Illinois, I was now a ward of the family. Solveig leaned in close, her breath smelling of peppermint. "You are nothing without this name, Ismay," she hissed. "Now we own you." I remained silent, looking past her at the rain-streaked windows. The greatest deception is believing you have won before the game has truly begun. They thought they were seizing my assets and locking me in a cage. In reality, by legally linking their accounts to my monitored funds, they had given me the exact legal justification I needed. Under the conduct integrity provision, I could now justify a total withdrawal as a security measure to protect the fund from their interference. They had built their own gallows. I turned and walked toward the revolving doors, leaving my executive badge on the mahogany reception desk. I didn't look back at the glass tower or the name etched in gold above the entrance. You cannot keep a bird in a cage if the bird owns the sky. I stepped out into the freezing Chicago rain, the water soaking through my suit. The weight of 10 years of silence was finally beginning to lift. I was no longer an inferior daughter. I was the architect of their ending. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The rear window rolled down slowly to reveal Lazarus. His face was a mask of cold, professional focus. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't ask how I was. He simply stared at the Price Global Tower and spoke. "The clock just hit 0, Ismay," he said. "The markets are closing in an hour. Do we pull the plug?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my father's worn handkerchief. I wiped the rain from my eyes and felt a surge of absolute, freezing resolve. "Let the world go dark for them," I replied. The sedan cut through the industrial fog of the Chicago port, the headlights carving a path through the swirling mist and the smell of heavy diesel. I sat in the passenger seat, the rhythmic drumming of rain on the metal roof sounding like a frantic heartbeat against the heavy silence inside. I pulled my father's worn handkerchief from my pocket, the fabric rough against my skin. A person's true north isn't found on a map, but in the promises they keep to themselves when no one is watching. I held that thought like a weapon. The city behind me was a blur of neon and betrayal, but out here, near the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan, everything felt strangely, terrifyingly clear. Lazarus kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. He wasn't just the consultant my family thought they had hired, he was the shadow they never saw coming. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a heavy, secure terminal, placing it on my lap. "I'm not just here to advise, Ismay," he said, his voice dropping into a low, professional frequency. I've spent 3 years with federal oversight tracking the very shadow funds your mother was trying to exploit. We've been looking for the architect behind ISM asset for a long time. He looked at me then, a flicker of respect in his tired eyes. I just didn't expect the architect to be the girl they treated like furniture. I ran my fingers over the cold casing of the terminal. For a brief second, I felt the weight of the legacy I was about to dismantle. Lazarus watched me, his expression grave. Are you sure about this? Once the heartbeat of that empire stops, there's no reviving it. You're destroying a name that stood for generations. I managed a bittersweet smile, my gaze fixed on the harbor lights. I'm not destroying a legacy, Lazarus. I'm amputating a rot to save what's left of the family name. Sometimes, the most merciful thing you can do is let a house of cards fall so the people inside can learn to walk on solid ground again. I wasn't acting out of a desire for revenge. I was acting as a steward of the justice my father believed in. Forgiveness is a private grace, but accountability is a public necessity. If I stayed silent, I was an accomplice to their greed. I felt a profound peace settling in my chest, a boundary being drawn in the sand that could never be erased. I still remember the silence in that car. It wasn't the silence of defeat, but the quiet of a soul finally choosing itself over its captors. That was the moment Ismay Price died, and the woman I was meant to be finally took a breath. I logged into the terminal, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. The portal for ISM Asset Management flickered to life, showing the massive capital reserves waiting to be deployed. I explained to Lazarus that the $5.1 billion hadn't come from some faceless billionaire. It was built from my own patents, my intellectual property, and the early investments my father secretly helped me set up before the cancer took him. He knew Griselda's nature better than anyone. He knew the day would come when I would need a fortress of my own. The money was never meant to be a gift. It was a mirror. I had given Griselda a full year to prove she was a leader of integrity before this final wire transfer was scheduled. I wanted to believe that somewhere beneath the emeralds and the ego, a mother still existed. But by treating me as inferior and attempting to auction my life away to a senator like a piece of livestock, she had failed the final audit of her own humanity. Money doesn't change people. It merely peels away the layers of pretense to show who they were all along. I felt the last of my unearned guilt evaporate into the freezing air. The legal mechanism was already in place. Under U.S. financial law and the specific conduct integrity provision I had written into the ISM asset bylaws, I held the sole right to withdraw the capital commitment if the recipient leadership engaged in documented reputational harm. The footage from the boardroom, the laughter, the inferior verdict, the physical removal, was the triggering event. It was the evidence of a leadership culture so toxic it posed a material risk to the investment. I wasn't the one breaking the contract. They had broken it the moment they decided my dignity was negotiable. I looked at the confirmation button. The $5.1 billion was the only thing keeping Price Global Holdings from a catastrophic debt default. Without it, the bridge loans they had taken out would become toxic overnight. I was the only person in the world who could hold my mother accountable, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the weight. The invisible daughter was finally stepping into the light, even if that light was the fire that would burn the house down. With a steady hand, I entered the authorization code. I didn't hesitate. The screen flashed a brilliant clinical white, commitment revoked, liquidity withdrawal initiated. I watched the numbers tumble. $5.1 billion began its journey out of the escrow accounts and back into the vaults of ISM asset. The pulse of the empire slowed, then stopped. Somewhere in the city, the servers at Price Global would be screaming, but out here there was only the sound of the waves hitting the pier. Even in the cold triumph of the moment, I said a silent prayer for my father. I knew the fallout would be catastrophic for the family, but I had already taken steps to protect the innocent. I had structured the withdrawal so that the rank-and-file employees' pension funds were ring-fenced and fully funded. My target was the executive greed, the top-heavy structure built on the backs of people they didn't even know. I handed the terminal back to Lazarus, my fingers numb from the cold. "Justice isn't about the strike," I whispered. "It's about the balance that follows." Lazarus took the device, his face unreadable. "By morning, Ismay, you'll be the most hated woman in the family. They'll come for you with everything they have left." I looked out at the dark, infinite waters of Lake Michigan. I wasn't the girl who had been laughed out of the room anymore. I was the storm they hadn't bothered to forecast. Closure doesn't come from an apology you'll never get. It comes from the boundaries you finally have the courage to set. I realized then that my father hadn't left me a fortune. He had left me the tools to find my own freedom. The first of the 120 missed calls began to vibrate against my leg. The phone buzzed with an insistent, desperate energy, but I didn't even reach for it. I watched a single snowflake melt against the warm glass of the car window, a tiny life ending in a smear of water. "Let it burn," I whispered into the stillness, "so we can finally see the stars again." The silence in the car was absolute, a holy thing. Lazarus's phone suddenly erupted in a chorus of pings and alerts. He looked down at the screen, his expression becoming grave as the market data updated in real time. "The market just noticed the void, Ismay," he said, the blue light of the phone casting long shadows across his face. "The debt-to-equity ratio just flipped into the red. Your mother's phone is already lighting up the Chicago sky. This isn't just a withdrawal anymore. It's an extinction event." I leaned my head back against the leather seat and closed my eyes. The battle hadn't been won with a shout, but with a quiet withdrawal of support. I thought about the books in my father's old study and the way he used to mark the pages he loved. I felt him with me then, a steady hand on my shoulder as the plane of my old life tilted into the abyss. I watched the red digital digits on the dashboard clock roll over to 8 a.m. Outside the window of the quiet diner, Chicago was waking up under a bruise-colored sky, indifferent to the financial earthquake currently leveling the Price name. I sat alone in a corner booth, the scent of burnt coffee and old vinyl floor wax clinging to the air. On the small television mounted above the counter, the stock ticker for Price Global Holdings looked like a jagged wound. It was a sea of red. The anchor's voice was a low murmur, speaking of unprecedented liquidity voids and the sudden withdrawal of major capital partners. The most expensive thing in the world is a lie that everyone believes. For 30 years, my family had sold the world a lie of invincibility. This morning, the truth had finally presented its bill. Lazarus entered the diner, the bell above the door jingling with a lonely sound. He wasn't in the sedan anymore. He wore a crisp, formal suit, his expression a mask of official neutrality. He sat across from me and placed his badge on the scarred wooden table. Federal oversight. He didn't need to speak for me to know the result. The $5.1 billion withdrawal had done more than just stop a crooked acquisition. It had triggered a mandatory, systematic audit of the family's entire collateral structure. I wasn't surprised. I knew that by removing the keystone I had secretly provided, the entire arch would collapse. "I didn't take their money, Lazarus," I said, my voice steady as I watched the steam rise from my cup. "I simply stopped providing the oxygen for a fire that was already consuming them." I watched a news clip of the Price Global Tower. Security was already turning people away. I felt no rush of adrenaline, no heat of revenge, only a heavy, profound quietude. We discussed the fate of the rank-and-file employees, the thousands of people who had no part in Griselda's greed. I had spent months structuring the ISM withdrawal to ensure the federal government could seize the remaining liquidity to prioritize severance and pensions. A true leader eats last. My mother and sisters forgot that the people are the foundation, not the decorations. Ismay, the girl they laughed out of the room, was the only one who had bothered to ensure the foundation didn't crush everyone when the walls fell. Lazarus leaned forward, his eyes searching mine. He began to explain the debt shift, a legal consequence of their own arrogance. The documents Griselda and Solveig had forced me to sign, the inheritance waiver, contained a hidden trapdoor. By legally separating me from the family assets to avoid my supposed instability, they had accidentally isolated me from the personal liability of the $5.1 billion loan default. Under U.S. bankruptcy law, because Griselda, Solveig, and Amaryllis were the sole signatories on the bridge loans they took out to replace my influence. The debt didn't just hit the corporation. It hit them personally. They were now personally liable for every cent of the failed acquisition. The hole you dig for others is often the one you fall into yourself. I didn't have to push them. I just had to step aside. I watched a bird land on the windowsill outside, chirping at the gray morning. They thought their inferior comment was a weapon to keep me down. They didn't realize it was a projection of their own inner void. They thought I was the one at the bottom of the table, I whispered to the steam of my coffee. They forgot that the table only stands because I built the legs. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and placed it on the table. For a second, it was still. Then, it began to vibrate. The rhythm was continuous, frantic, and unrelenting. The screen was a blur of names flashing in rapid succession. Griselda, Solveig, Amaryllis. The vibration was so intense the phone began to dance across the wood. 45 calls from my mother. 35 from Solveig. 40 from Amaryllis. A total of 120 missed calls in less than an hour. To me, it wasn't a victory. It was a symphony of desperation. I didn't answer. I sat and watched the names flash until they became meaningless characters on a screen. Character is how you treat those who can do nothing for you. They were only calling now because I was the only person left on Earth with the power to save them. Lazarus asked if I wanted to block the numbers. I shook my head. No. Let them ring, I said. They need to sit in the silence of their own making for a while. It's the only way they'll ever hear their own conscience. The phone finally went quiet for a brief heartbeat. The silence of the diner felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Then, a single text message pinged from my mother. It wasn't an apology. It was a weaponized plea. I'm at the end, Ismay. If you don't call back, I'll end it all. I looked at the words, my eyes softening with a familiar pity, but my hand remained still. The last tool of a tyrant is the threat of their own destruction. She was trying to trade her life for the billions she had lost, still treating existence like a transaction. I slid the phone face down on the table, the black glass reflecting the dull light of the diner. I stood up and pulled a $20 bill from my wallet, leaving a generous tip for the waitress who had been watching the news with wide eyes. It's time to see if she's finally telling the truth, I whispered to Lazarus. I stepped out into the biting Chicago air, where a black car from the federal marshal's office was waiting at the curb. I was going to a hotel I'd never stayed in before, a place where the name Price meant nothing. The wind howled around the street corner, carrying the scent of rain and the breath of an approaching winter. As the car door closed, shutting out the city's noise, I felt a strange, chilling peace. The debt was due, and I wasn't the one paying it. I watched the diner disappear in the rearview mirror, a tranquil place where reality seemed more familiar than ever, even in our luxurious penthouse apartment. The heavy velvet curtains of my hotel suite muffled the roar of downtown Chicago, creating a sanctuary of sterile luxury that felt worlds away from the diners and docks of the last 48 hours. I sat by the window watching the rain blur the streetlights, my mind a fortress of cold determination. The silence was broken by a sharp, authoritative pounding on the door. I didn't flinch. I had been expecting a desperate move from them, but I hadn't expected them to be this clumsy. I opened the door to find Solveig standing there, her face a mask of frantic, rehearsed distress. Behind her stood 2 uniformed police officers. "There she is!" Solveig shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. They presented a search warrant, claiming a $10 million diamond necklace had vanished from the gala and a reliable witness had seen me near the safe. Within minutes, an officer pulled the shimmering piece of carbon from the side pocket of my carry-on bag. Solveig had planted it, a desperate gamble to regain the leverage I had stripped from her. I watched the scene with a detached, clinical eye. A lion does not turn around when a small dog barks. Their malice was merely a symptom of their impending bankruptcy, a frantic attempt to swap my freedom for the $5.1 billion they had lost. I remained silent, my heart steady, as the lead officer waited for a confession. Instead of arguing, I walked to the hotel desk and opened my laptop. Evidence is only as strong as the integrity of the person who found it, I said, my voice cutting through Solveig's feigned sobs. I turned the screen to show the time-stamped security footage from the hallway, which I had secured the moment I checked in. It clearly showed Solveig entering my room with a master key while I was out at the diner. I suggest you check the fingerprints on the clasp before you proceed, I told the officer. I looked at Solveig, feeling a weary compassion. It is tragic that you value a piece of carbon more than the sister standing in front of you. I didn't want to see her in a cell. I wanted her to find a conscience. As the officers turned their questioning toward a stuttering Solveig, my phone vibrated. A FaceTime call from Griselda. I answered, and the screen filled with the image of a dimly lit bathroom. My mother was holding a bottle of pills, her eyes red from sobbing. "Life is over without the Empire, Ismay," she gasped, her voice a ragged whisper. "This is your fault. If I go tonight, my blood is on your hands." It was the ultimate emotional blackmail, the final attempt to trade her life for a bailout. I studied the screen. I noticed the staged lighting and the fact that the bottle she held was a common brand of over-the-counter vitamins. Manipulation is the last resort of a person who has lost all real power. She was attempting to use my empathy as a leash, still treating our relationship like a hostile takeover. I stayed seated, refusing to be the audience for the woman she had become. "Mother," I said, my voice soft but unshakable. "If you are truly in a crisis, you need professional help, not a bank transfer. I love the woman you were supposed to be, but I will not be the audience for this charade." I didn't rush to her. I didn't panic. I chose sanity over the cycle of abuse. I hung up the phone and looked at Lazarus, who had been watching from the doorway. The cord wasn't just cut, it was cauterized. I utilized the mental health crisis laws of Illinois immediately. I contacted the emergency psychiatric evaluation team and the police, providing the video of her threat as documented evidence of a self-harm risk. Under the law, her documented behavior required a mandatory 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold. Instead of a bank wire, Griselda was met at the penthouse by paramedics. I wasn't punishing her. I was putting her in a place where she could finally face herself without the distraction of a boardroom. It was the only way to save her from her own shadow. Sometimes, walking away is the most courageous form of love. I ensured she was placed in the most prestigious facility in the state, paying for the private care out of my own accounts, not the family's evaporating assets. I acted on the principle of self-preservation and genuine care, not the petty desire for revenge. True freedom is realizing that you are not responsible for the dysfunction of people who refuse to be helped. I stood by the window as the distant siren of the ambulance faded into the city hum. Lazarus walked over, his expression unreadable. "She's secure, Ismay. The doctors are with her." I nodded, feeling the weight of 10 years of unearned guilt finally slide off my shoulders. I was no longer the inferior daughter. I was the only adult left in the room. I had protected the family name by refusing to let it be used as a suicide note. The air in the room felt lighter. The velvet curtains no longer felt like a shroud. As the last ambulance light disappeared, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, the caller ID blocked. I answered, and a raspy, unfamiliar voice echoed through the line. "You think you've won, little girl? Your mother isn't the only one with secrets. Check your father's old private safe, the one in the basement of the Northbridge office." The line clicked dead before I could respond. The dead don't keep secrets, but the basements do. I looked at Lazarus, the reflection of the city lights dancing in my eyes. "We aren't going back to the hotel," I told him, my voice filled with a new, haunted resolve. "We're going back to the beginning." I knew the story of my father's empire hadn't been fully told yet. I was ready for the final layer of truth, no matter how much it cost to unearth it. We walked out of the suite, leaving the sterile luxury behind for the cold, honest wind of the Chicago streets. The Chicago streets were whip-cold, the wind cutting through my dark suit as I stepped out of the sedan and toward the towering glass monolith of Price Global. The building stood like a tombstone under the morning sun, its revolving doors now crossed with yellow federal tape and official seals. I didn't hesitate. I had spent my life walking into this building as a shadow. an afterthought, a girl who existed only to fill an empty chair. Today, I was walking in as the light that would expose every dark corner of this family's legacy. I found Solveig in the lobby, standing amidst the cold marble and the echoing silence of a shuttered empire. She looked disheveled, her expensive hair matted by the wind, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. The second she saw me, she lunged forward, clutching a manila envelope as if it were a life raft. "I have it, Ismay!" she hissed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I have the dirt on your early offshore accounts. One call to the marshals and you're going down with us. You think you're better than us? You're just as dirty." I didn't flinch. I didn't even slow my pace. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out a tablet, and pressed play. The grainy, silent video from 3 years ago filled the screen. It showed Solveig in a back office, methodically siphoning client funds into a private shell company, the very embezzlement I had discovered and quietly covered up with my own money. She froze, the color draining from her face until she was as white as the marble beneath her feet. I had bought those files years ago, not to use them as a weapon, but to keep her out of a prison cell, hoping against hope that she would eventually choose to be better. I looked at my sister, my heart heavy with a disappointment that transcended anger. "I kept your secrets because I wanted to save the person I thought you were, Solveig," I said, my voice barely above a whisper but filling the empty lobby. "I didn't hold this over your head like a sword. I held it like a shield to protect you from yourself. But today, you chose to use a lie against the only person who ever protected your truth. The truth doesn't cost anything, but a lie will eventually cost you everything." She had effectively blackmailed herself, and there was nothing left for me to do but walk past her. The elevator climbed to the executive floor in a blur of steel and glass. Federal marshals and bank representatives were already waiting in the hallway. Griselda's personal default on the bridge loans had triggered a massive UCC-1 lien foreclosure on all family-owned property. I handed the lead marshal a certified digital ledger. My fund, ISM Asset, had just purchased the distressed debt from the banks at a deep discount. I wasn't a guest, and I wasn't an employee. I was the landlord. Under U.S. foreclosure law, I had the immediate right to secure the premises and remove all occupants who had defaulted on their personal guarantees. I stood in the center of the executive suite as my private security team began the process. I wasn't cruel. I had hired professional movers to pack their personal belongings with care, but I was firm. Everything had to be on the sidewalk within the hour. Luxury is a privilege of the responsible, not the entitlement of the cruel. Amaryllis appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with a shock that had finally turned into fear. She tried to plead, her voice small and broken, but I simply reached into my suit jacket and handed her a modest check. "This is not a payoff, Amaryllis," I told her, my eyes meeting hers with a steady, clinical calm. "It is a lifeline. It's enough for a small apartment for 6 months. I am removing the pedestal you used to look down on others, so you can finally learn to stand on the ground with the people you ignored." I saw the moment the realization hit her, that the world of private jets and penthouse galas was gone, replaced by the honest, difficult reality of being just another person. It was the only way she would ever find her own soul again. I walked through the empty penthouse, the air still smelling of the lavender candles Griselda loved. I stopped at the very spot where I had been laughed at just nights ago, the memory of that sharp, mocking laughter now a distant echo. I knelt and placed a single bouquet of white lilies on the cold marble floor, a symbol of mourning for the family I wished I had, and a rebirth for the woman I had become. Success without honor is just a well-decorated failure. I wasn't building a new empire today. I was building a new standard for the name I carried. Lazarus stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the Chicago skyline. I walked over to join him, feeling the strange, weightless sensation of a war finally ending. My revenge wasn't a strike. It was simply allowing the laws of the universe and the laws of the land to work as they were intended. I didn't have to break them. I just had to stop holding them up while they tried to break me. Ever lost everything? Your home, your status, your pride, just to realize those were the things keeping you from seeing who you truly are? Lazarus turned to me, his face softened by a rare, genuine smile. He handed me a weathered leather folder found in my father's basement safe. It wasn't a bank statement or a deed. It was an unmailed letter addressed to me, dated the week he died. On the back, in his familiar sloping handwriting, were a set of geographic coordinates. My hand trembled as I gripped the paper, the ink feeling like a message from beyond the abyss. He knew. My father had known this day would come, and he had left me one final path to follow. I looked out at the city, the buildings glowing like embers in the morning light. "Tell the pilot to ready the plane," I said to Lazarus, my voice filled with a new soulful resonance. "We have one more stop to make before the sun sets." The Chicago I knew was behind me, its glass towers no longer casting shadows over my heart. I was ready for the final layer of truth, the one that lay beyond the money and the marble. I walked toward the elevator, the letter tucked safely against my chest, ready to go back to the dirt where it all began. The private hangar at O'Hare was a vast cavern of polished concrete and the low, industrial hum of jet engines. Outside, the Chicago sun was surrendering to the horizon, bleeding shades of violet and bruised gold across the runway. I stood by the stairs of the Gulf Stream, my white coat fluttering in the wind that smelled of rain and hot asphalt. In my hand, I gripped the letter Lazarus had found in the safe, the final message from a father who had seen the storm coming long before the first cloud appeared. I wasn't running away. I was finally walking toward the only truth that mattered. A commotion at the security gate drew my attention. Solveig and Amaryllis were there, blocked by a phalanx of guards. They looked smaller than I remembered, their sharp edges softened by the frantic reality of their new lives. They weren't there to throw insults or plant jewelry this time. They were there to beg. As I approached the gate, I didn't feel the heat of victory or the coldness of spite. I felt a weary, stoic mercy. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. I looked at my sisters and saw not monsters, but people who had simply never learned how to be whole without a price tag attached to their souls. I didn't mock their disheveled clothes or the loss of the tower. Instead, I handed Lazarus 2 envelopes, trust fund documents I had finalized an hour ago. "These are irrevocable trusts for your basic living expenses," I said, my voice steady against the roar of a nearby plane. "It's enough for a quiet life, provided you stay away from the boardrooms and the cameras." Amaryllis looked at the papers, then at me, her voice trembling. "Why? After everything we did to you, why are you being kind?" I offered her a sad, honest smile. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for the memory of the father who loved us all. I won't let your greed tarnish the name he worked so hard to build. I'm not rewarding your betrayal. I'm honoring my own integrity." I told them that Griselda would remain in the facility, receiving the finest psychiatric care money could buy, but she would no longer have an audience for her toxic charades. I was severing the anchor that had kept us all drowning in the dark. Forgiveness is setting a prisoner free and discovering that the prisoner was you. As I turned back toward the jet, I felt the weight of 30 years finally lift. I had done what the law required and what my conscience demanded. Compassion is not weakness. It is the ultimate form of strength. The hangar doors opened wider to admit a small group of financial journalists. This was the final step in the purge. I stood before the cameras, not as Ismay Price, the victim of a family coup, but as the architect of a necessary ending. I officially announced the legal dissolution of the Price Global Holdings name. The brand was being liquidated, its history of greed buried under the weight of its own debts. I watched the reporters scramble to record the death of an American dynasty. "I am also dropping the Price surname," I said, looking directly into the primary lens. "I am reclaiming my father's original family name, one that represented hard work and honesty before it was traded for a seat at the head of a crooked table. Power doesn't belong to those who shout from the top. It belongs to the person who makes sure everyone has a place at the bottom. My mother thought I was nothing because I didn't play her game, but she forgot that I was the one who wrote the rules. A person's worth is measured by the shadow they cast, not the lights they stand under. From today, my family is no longer a business entity. It is a lesson in accountability." The flight to the rural coordinates was short, the jet's cabin filled with a peaceful, resonant silence. Lazarus sat across from me, watching the clouds. I finally opened my father's letter and read the sloping script. It wasn't about money or hidden accounts. It was a map to a small, quiet orchard in rural Illinois where he had grown up, a place he had bought back in secret and left to me. He wrote that I was the only one who would understand the value of the dirt over the gold. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. I told Lazarus that this orchard would be my new office. I planned to build a sanctuary there, a place for those marginalized by the very greed of corporations that had nearly devoured me. I wanted to turn $5.1 billion into a legacy of healing, not hoarding. He asked me how it felt when 120 calls went silent and the empire vanished. I leaned back in my chair and watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. I felt the silence. It wasn't loneliness. It was home. True honor isn't about winning the war, but about holding your spirits when things calm down. I looked at the coordinates one last time and noticed a small handwritten note at the bottom of the page. Father was never the one to shoulder everything, Ismay. You were. And I always will be. Those words were the only legacy I truly needed.